everybody. My name is Lydia McVeigh. I am the Executive Director of the Virginia Club of New York. I'm a 2021 graduate, so some of you may know my predecessor, Amelia. I am so excited to welcome you all to this event with Professor Francesca Fiorani. This is one of my first faculty events as the Executive Director, and I'm very excited that this is co-hosted by our studio community of interest. That's our Arts Affinity group, and it's headed by Julia Pedrick and Claire Spooner, who are two of our board members. Julia is the blank screen on your screen because she is experiencing some connectivity issues. However, if her audio is working, I will let her introduce Professor Fiorani. If not, I will do the honors myself. So I'm gonna hand it over to Julia at this point.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience with me and my mysterious faceless little box. I hope sound is not too bad, but my name is Julia Pedrick, as Lydia mentioned. I am a class 2015 grad and COM 2016 grad, and I co-lead Studio as part of the Virginia Club of New York with Claire Spooner. And Studio is the arts and culture affinity group. We host numerous events, both in person and virtual, like this one, where we get to experience the arts and culture both locally in New York, but also around the world, especially in one of my favorite places, Charlottesville. So I'm very excited to introduce Professor Francesca Fiorani. She is the Associate Dean for the Arts and Humanities, the Professor of Renaissance Art, and the primary investigator for the Mellon Indigenous Arts Initiative at the University of Virginia. Combining her longstanding interest in art, science, and technology with her current research on Leonardo da Vinci's optics, she created the digital publication Leonardo da Vinci and his Treatise on Painting. Today, Professor Fiorani will take us through her new insights on Leonardo da Vinci based on her book, The Shadow Drawing: How Science Taught Leonardo da Vinci How to Paint. With that, I will pass it over to Professor Fiorani.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Julia, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you to Lydia and to the New York Club for the invitation to talk to you. It's a total pleasure to do so, and especially because what I'll be talking about, the book that I just published, well, it's been by now a few months, is a book that is really ingrained in my time at UVA as a professor. And I have a special attachment to all my students, but especially to two classes of my Leonardo classes. One is the class of spring 2020. And we started to meet in person, and then we went remote because of the pandemic. But that class was the class who heard me lecturing from the book. I was sort of polishing the book, the final version of the book. So they did not know that, but every week they would heard a chapter of that book. I did tell them at the very end of the semester that was the case. The other favorite class was the following semester, and that was the class that actually, at that point, the book was in print, and also we read it together. And it was, so those are classes I'm really attached to. For somehow they really accompanied me in this publication. Perhaps I should start to share my screen. Give me just 1 minute, and I have some nice images that I would like to share with you today. Okay, here we go. Okay. And so that's the book, The Shadow Drawing: How Science Taught Leonardo How to Paint. And you might wonder why another book on Leonardo. So much has been said about him. But in this book, I argue that we cannot understand him unless, sorry, I need a little more light here near me, okay? unless we see that he was a scientist throughout his career. He did not become a scientist, he was one all along. And we often think about him as a dual genius, the great artist who gave us the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, and also as the great scientist who invented things that did not exist yet, like the flying machine or the parachute. And indeed, this view of Leonardo really fits with our modern two-culture mindset, as that is a mindset that divides the art and the sciences. But this mindset flips on its head what made the Renaissance, a time when artists were deeply interested in science, not apart from their art, but because of it. And for no artist, this was truer than Leonardo, who lived between painting, botany, architecture, cosmology, hydraulics, and much more. And it is perhaps this mindset, which we would call today an interdisciplinary mindset, that we crave again. And that's perhaps one of the reasons I like so much those Leonardo classes I teach at UVA, because I get there students from many, many different disciplines, from the engineering school, architecture, education, the college, and the college, both the humanities and the arts, but also the sciences and social sciences. So in that classroom, we try to recreate that interdisciplinary mindset that puts the arts and sciences together. So in the book, what I argue is that to understand his use of science, we must look closely at his shadow drawings. And you see on the screen an example of that. These drawings taught him precisely how to paint the human soul. And this is really Leonardo's true legacy and how he wanted to be remembered. In these drawings, he depicted light not as we see it, as one solid beam, but rather as a set of discrete rays, charting the individual destination of each and every one, line by line. Clearly, he knew something about the science of light and shadows, because with great precision, he identifies which rays would hit a ball. It's the ball that we see in this drawing here. I think you can see my pointer. And you know, it's a ball here, it's an abstract solid object. But you can imagine that instead of a ball, you have there a human head, the head of one of the figures in his paintings. So he knew exactly how light and shades behave. And I wrote a book to argue that what made Leonardo was precisely the science of optics, and that it was as a young boy training in Florence that he discovered the power of the science of optics to represent emotions in his paintings. Now, what I would like to do today with you is to perhaps show you some of the research that went behind my book, some of the experiences, some of the readings, some of the visits I had to do throughout the years, materials that made it possible for me to write the book, but materials that not necessarily got into the book in the way that I'm going to present it to you. And I should say that when I started this work, I really wanted to understand sentences like the one you see here on the screen, sentences that Leonardo wrote. Painting should represent man and the intentions of his mind. We would say today emotions, but that's what he meant. That's what he said, the words he used, intentions of his mind. He also wrote some sentences like, Figures in painting ought to move who behold, they admire them in the same way as the protagonist of the narrative is moved. So clearly he was looking for an emotional bond between the painted figures and we viewers who look at those works. So, but to try to understand how he created this emotional bond based on science, I really needed to look at Leonardo's works up close, very, very carefully. And I needed to look at them without protective glasses, with special lamps, sometimes with the help of ladders, and often talking with curators and restorers. And that was a task that was easier to imagine than actually to accomplish. Leonardo's paintings are among the most guarded works of art in the entire world. And here I'm showing you just two images of his famous Mona Lisa as it is shown in the Louvre. And you can see that, you know, there are screens of people between you and the painting. And then when you make it finally to the front of the line, still you are very, very far away from the painting. So that kind of viewing would not have helped my research, would have not moved my research forward. But I was very lucky to have the opportunity to look at those paintings in different conditions. Curators and the museum directors and conservators understood what was my quest and made all that was in their power to facilitate it. And what I'm showing you now are some images of what I call the Mona Lisa Day. This day is a day that happens usually on a Tuesday when the Louvre is closed once a year. And on that special day, the Mona Lisa comes out of its protective glass and case, and the person you see here on the right is the head curator of Renaissance painting at the Louvre. His name is Vincent de Levienne, who is also a Leonardo expert. So the painting is taken out and is put on an easel, and this is the man who has the privilege of handling the Mona Lisa. And it stays on the easel. And at the beginning, it stays on the easel with the front facing the back of the easel. So if you ever wondered what the back of the Mona Lisa looks like, here it is. And all those bars that you see, it's a complex monitoring system on the panel, which of course you don't see when it is inside the case. And here, and that back of the panel is something that everybody is deeply interested in, monitoring any alteration of the wood, which would indicate an alteration then of the painted surface. Oops, sorry, here. Then finally, the panel turns the right way, and that's what everybody looks at very, very carefully. That's Vincent again. That's it was the director of the Louvre at the time. This was a couple of years ago. That's me, and that's other colleagues. And then this operation takes hours and hours. Starts early in the morning, goes on until late in the day. Nobody leaves the room. Nobody eats. Nobody drinks. It's almost like you know, a cloistered experience. But that gives us the time to talk, to exchange views, and that's what you see me talking with Vincent extensively. Then finally, the panel goes on a table, and what is removed is the frame, all the monitoring systems built around it, and there it goes. I call it, this is probably one of my favorite images, one of my favorite moments as an art historian, when I saw the painting. I call it the Mona Lisa in the nude, right? No frame, no protective glass, nothing, just the panel as Leonardo painted it over 500 years ago. That's the moment in which this icon of Western art became for me a painting. That is paint on wood, put there by an artist. I was able, therefore, to look at it really very up close. I should say I even touch it, although we were not allowed to, but I sort of couldn't resist that. Don't tell anybody, because, like I said, we were not allowed to. Then the Mona Lisa is really a kind of a diva. So part of the monitoring is taking, I mean, they set up a shooting station for her, and lots of different pictures are taken, infrared, X-rays, and all sorts of other images. They all get into the computer, so they're part of the diagnostic that is yearly done on the Mona Lisa. After she has been photographed, she is put on a scale. So what you see here is really the Mona Lisa, the real painting on the ground, on the floor. In fact, not really on the floor, it's on a digital scale. And what you see here is the cord of that digital scale. And this kind of white box that is about to be moved. There's a white box that goes on top of the Mona Lisa on the scale, in order to get a very precise weight of the painting. And that is done because any alteration of the weight is an indication of the alteration of the wood on which Leonardo painted, and there are possible deterioration of the work. All this allowed me to see the painting from up close, and I'm showing you a couple of details, and therefore established that the Mona Lisa actually was never finished. And something that most people do not know. Those areas, right, of the landscape, those brownish areas, right behind the Mona Lisa, now that they're right brownish, those are not valleys. What we see, the brown that we see, is the ground preparation that Leonardo put on the panel, on top of which he would have added colors, most probably some kind of bluish colors. So this would have been a river, not a road. So it would have been a continuation of the river, on the waterways and the lakes that we see in the background. So that was particularly interesting. Maybe a couple of more details. Yes, a couple of more details of those two brownish areas that show that he never finished the painting. This was a kind of an experimental painting he kept with himself till the very end of his life. And the poor man who had commissioned this painting as a portrait of his wife, the poor silk merchant, never got to have the painting of his wife. Another restoration that was able to follow up close, and so the other painting that I saw many, many times as it was being cleaned and restored, is the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, a painting which is also at the Louvre. Here, two images before and after the restoration. A couple of more details here pertaining to the landscape of that same painting. Here, the restorer who worked out, cleaned the paint, this Leonardo painting, Cinzia Pasquale. She is from Rome, just like myself. She lives in Paris for many years. She's one of the most talented restorers in the world today. So she restored a number of Leonardo paintings, and who knows, maybe one day she'll restore the Mona Lisa herself. And this other painting gave us a clear understanding of how Leonardo created landscapes and the kind of light that reflected on on his figures. But the real breakthrough for me was when I started to look at Leonardo, the paintings that Leonardo did when he was a young artist living in Florence, and by and large still associated with the workshop of his master. Again, those paintings, it took a lot of diplomacy, let's put it this way, to get access to these works, but it was an incredible experience, and I'll show you details in a minute of those works. Those works were particularly revelatory for me because it was always believed that Leonardo did not get interested in science until he was a mature man in his 40s. But a close look at these early works revealed to me a deep knowledge of the science of optics, and as I'll try to show you, suggested to me that theoretical training in the sciences must have started much earlier than we always thought, and that therefore this innovative painting was deeply connected to a deep knowledge of science. Let me see what I have next. Yes, let's look at this painting, the Annunciation, an Annunciation that it is striking for many things, but I'll just point out to a couple of elements that from an optical point of view are particularly striking. One is the landscape in the background, and I'll show you a detail of it in a minute. And the other is this base for the lectern on which Mary's book is set. Every artist knew back then that, let's see here, let's go to this detail of the landscape. Every artist knew back then that things appear smaller as they are more distant from us who looked at them. It's a sort of simple optical elements. But it was only Leonardo who fully understood that things do not only diminish in size with distance, but they also lose definition of colors. So bright colors tend to look all the same in the distance, kind of bluish as we see here. And on top of that, that also the details that are very clear in objects that are close to us become less and less distinct as that object is more distant from us. And this is done because there is more air, more atmosphere that intervenes between us viewers and the object that we are looking at. What he later called aerial perspective. So a perspective based on the quantity of air that there is between us and an object. And he tried to represent those optical effects in his painting. What I'm showing you here on the right is a page of Leonardo's writings. I don't know how many of you had the chance to look at them before. And of course, he wrote from right to left. And so here I'm pointing here to the title on Prospettiva Aerea. And not only I wrote it from left to right, but I also translated it into English for you. Another detail I really want to show is this incredible lectern. And as you can see, the top is a bit more yellowish because it is hit by the direct light of the sun, which is a little reddish, while this is the side of this lectern is not hit directly by red sunlight, and therefore it's a little more bluish. So here he has paid attention to not just colors and variation of colors due to distance, but also different color of light sources. What I'm showing you on the right is a diagram that he drew many decades later, explaining in geometrical terms the situation which he had painted when he was a young man. Here, I just want to show you another incredible work for me to look at up close, and that's the portrait of Ginevra de Benshi. This one is at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I'm showing here a detail of her face. And the gray image is actually an infrared image. An infrared image is an image taken with infrared, and what it does is these infrared rays are able to penetrate through the paint layers and allow us to see what's behind those paint layers. That is, it allows us to see the preparatory drawing that Leonardo sketched on the panel, and on top of which then he applied the colors. So we can see here beautifully, see all those dotted lines. So it means that it existed a drawing of Ginevra de Benshi. That this drawing did not arrive to us. We do not have it, but we know that he used it to transfer the facial features of this young lady into the panel. Look especially about the details of the eye, and the eye, which for Leonardo was the window to the soul. So pay great attention to the depiction of the eyes. Look also at those little touches. At this point here, this is a detail of the final painted surface. Those two little touches, those are the last touches that Leonardo put on the painting, again, to mark the eye. But what was really revelatory for me was, you see this mass here around Ginevra's hair, which corresponds to this area in the painted, in the final paint. And it's the area that then becomes the bush behind her. But on the panel, Leonardo did not sketch it precisely. So, but it's large brush strokes on it. And it's interesting because so we have this contrast of highly precise details and some that are very quickly sketched. Last one I want to show you is this another incredible restoration. This is the Adoration of the Magi, which is also at the Louvre, and I'm showing it to you after the restoration and in the new installation that was organized at the Louvre, at the Uffizi. We haven't been able to travel much lately, but if any of you will travel to Florence in the coming weeks or months, I suggest you to go and look at this new display of Leonardo's Adoration of the Magi. That's another restoration I was able to follow up close. I went to see it every few weeks just to see the progress. And again, you see how illegible the work was and how much more readable it became after the restoration. Couple of more images. This is the panel getting out of the Uffizi. And there was a bit of a suspense, as you can imagine, right, when it was lifted and then lowered outside the Uffizi. And then it's the same panel inside this amazing restoration lab in Florence. It's called the Opificio delle Pietre Dure, which is one of the top restoration labs in the world. They also have a training school, and students that come out of that restoration school basically are the most talented restorers in museums around the world, including at the Metropolitan and other New York museums. And here are two restorers, friends that I became friends after so many visits to the work. And I'm going to show you a couple of details of this work. The first one is this large infrared image of the panel. So that is, we see the drawing underneath, the drawing that Leonardo sketched on this panel, a drawing that he did entirely freehand. And that has never been done on such a huge, before him, on such a huge panel. And it's a work in progress. He changes his mind all the time. It's interesting here to see how many heads there are in this group of figures, right? And of course, only a few made it to the final, to the next stage of painting. Here is a detail on the other side. The detail is particularly interesting, this detail, because it shows the different, oh, sorry. Okay, here. Oh, the different emotions of people in front of the manifestation of the divine. This is the adoration of the Magi, that it is the moment in which the child Christ is recognized as the Son of God. So it's a moment of the revelation of the divinity of the child to the Gentile. And it's interesting that what clearly Leonardo is interested in is the different emotions that people show to that event. But for me, it was particularly interesting to look at this detail. I'm going to show you a detail of the background, right? This riding horse, and I'm going to point to the rear of that horse and how that rear of the horse is one of the parts that's most advanced in the entire painting, and that really recalls the balls that in the shadow drawings that he sketched few decades later. So all this somehow suggested to me that there was a possibility of a deeper knowledge of optics. Optics, which, as odd as it may seem to us today, was a very popular science in the Renaissance. Doctors used, it was taught at the university in the medical curriculum, right? I don't know that happens today because doctors needed the optics in order to study astronomy, and they needed to study astronomy in order to interrogate the stars to detect the right moment to diagnose maladies. I mean, those were the beliefs at the time. It was used by merchants to trace new trading routes by looking at the position of the stars. It was used to create astronomical instruments, including this one, which was in the Cathedral of Florence. A light ray, a sun ray, sorry, came through the church, right, and projected on the ground, and was an astronomical instrument, which, by the way, was built at the very same time when Leonardo was training in Florence. I'll return to that later. So where did Leonardo learn optics? He might have learned it going around Florence, as this was a topic that was discussed extensively in the Florence of his days. But he also had the good fortune of being in the right place at the right time. And that was the workshop of his master, Andrea del Verrocchio, an artist who was, perhaps I'll stay with this work, who was known for many things, but especially for his attention to light and shade in order to render the minutest asperities of people's faces and skins, which revealed, according to him, their inner world. And so it was he clearly was an artist who taught his pupils, including Leonardo, how to look carefully for those light effects, either on the face of people, but also on garments, but as well as in landscapes, in natural features. And what I'm showing you here is a work by Verrocchio, a painting of a Florentine man represented as if he were Saint Jerome. And then two early drawings by Leonardo, a drapery drawing and a landscape drawing, clearly inspired by Verrocchio's teaching. I'm going to show you now a detail very quickly of his handwriting here on the top of this drawing. And this is interesting because we can, again, it's upside, it's in reverse, but we can read the date 1473, right, and get a sense of, his handwriting a bit better. But what is particularly interesting is the way he painted, not painted, so this is a drawing, it's sketched trees as if they are, with the blurred edges, as if they are clouded by fog or maybe wind, okay? But in Verrocchio's workshop, the workshop of his master, Leonardo learned something else. He witnessed for sure, but maybe also participated to a major enterprise that that Verrocchio accomplished between 1468 and 71. So when Leonardo was around 20, from 17 to 2021. And that was the construction of this golden ball for the Cathedral of Florence, and the crowning element of the cathedral. And it was just a ball, but the ball was so big that it had to be done in pieces. And those pieces were pieces that could have been designed with great precision only if one knew very well spherical geometry. And here I have a sketch of spherical geometry that really teaches how to create those pieces in such a way that then when you assemble them together, they form a perfect ball. So there's a more advanced non-Euclidean geometry that clearly Verrocchio knew. But the point is how you put those pieces together. And there were welding instruments at the time. Of course, there was no electricity, right? So they had to use the heat of the sun. And that assembling of the ball had to happen up high at 140 feet, and with this wood scaffolding all around, right? And basically, it was pure madness, right? The project, it was a pure madness. How do you create fire at that height with scaffolding all around? But obviously the project succeeded, and succeeded because Verrocchio designed, built, and used a particular tool, which it's known as a burning mirror, a mirror which is a curved mirror, which reflects the sunlight and reflects them in such a way that all the reflected rays converge in one specific point where heat is very intense and where fire occurs. That's the name, burning mirror. And so by using this tool, he was able to assemble this golden ball. And that obviously the making of this mirror was based on the laws of optics. So we do not know what Leonardo did for the construction of the ball. We do not know even how exactly Verrocchio built that burning mirror, but we know that the event, that the enterprise succeeded. And we also know that Leonardo had kept throughout his life a clear memory of that project. When he was an old man, a famous artist at that point, he recalled that particular event, that particular building of the golden ball in a note which I'll show you here on the screen. The important point for us is that he clearly was exposed to advanced knowledge and of optics at that very early stage. And that is probably the moment in which he operated an intellectual leap that moved from burning mirrors, from the science of optics applied to burning mirrors for the operation of the golden globe, to painting, how that science, if properly applied, could have helped him to get to the inner soul of the figure he painted. That also helped me understand so put me on the search of, okay, where did he go to read about optical? Where did he learn this stuff? And so after a kind of a bit of research, it became apparent that there was a text available in Florence, very close to Leonardo and his circle, that he could have read. The text was an optical text, a very important optical text that had been written in Arabic in the 11th century by an Arab philosopher. His name was Ibn al-Haytham, but in the Renaissance it was known as Al-Azin. Then that text was translated into Latin sometimes in the 13th century. And then, truly exceptional, it was translated into Italian into the 14th century. That is, it was translated into a language that artists like Leonardo could read. Not only this, but a copy of this text was available in Florence in artistic circles, and we know was in the hand of a dear friend of Leonardo. And this was important because what was special about this text was that it explained not only that the eye is the prince of the senses, but that the eye is never mistaken. Everything we learn through the eye is always correct. And so basically, is a book about the acquisition of knowledge through sensory experience. Primary, the sensory data acquired through the eye. So this means that actually to be a great scholar of optics, one had to be a great observer of nature. Having understood that, it became clear to me that many sentences that Leonardo wrote later in life, such as this one, experience is not at fault. It is only our judgment that is in error. Those sentences were not invented by Leonardo, but were his rephrasing of Alazin's theory of knowledge, the optical theory that he must have learned as a youth. Alazin also taught him the importance of the atmosphere. According to Alazin, as I said, the eye never errs, But then when we have wrong perceptions, that's due not because the eye doesn't work well, but because there are elements that interfere with our perception, that that put vision in an unfavorable conditions. And the main element, there are many elements, but the main elements that produce those false illusions is the atmosphere. And now we start to understand why the atmosphere was really important for Leonardo, the painter. He also learned from Alhazen that the atmosphere is not something separate. So there is the atmosphere, and then there are people and things in the world. Alhazen taught him that the atmosphere is in continuous contact with everything. And therefore, Leonardo understood that if you wanted to, including the faces of people, if you want to get the emotions of people and therefore capture the minutest changes in expressions or muscles movement, then you have to be able to capture that atmospheres that reflects on them. And so suddenly sentences that we have read before, painting should represent man and the intention of his mind, become very clear why the atmosphere and optics were fundamental for getting to the soul of people. Leonardo eventually wrote his own, planned to write his book on painting, which was, I would say, an optical book for artists, and Alhazen for artists, right? And like many other things, he never finished it, right? He didn't complete it, so we have bits and pieces of it. That book got transmitted in various ways. I talk extensively about the transmission of his ideas on painting throughout the centuries. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but after all, we are all connected to Jefferson's University. So I thought I'll take a minute to point out that actually Jefferson did own the first English translation of Leonardo's treatise on painting. The book had been printed in London in 1721. And it is documented in his library at Monticello between 1770 and 1815. 1815, when he sold his library to the Library of Congress to pay his bills, a story that is very well known. And we do not have anymore the specific copy that Jefferson owned of Leonardo's treatise on painting, but with the special collections does have a copy, and that's actually the picture that I'm showing you. It's taken from that copy that we have a special collection at UVA, a book that I used for one of my digital projects. Since we are at Jefferson and Leonardo, let me mention one more thing, which is really interesting. In the main hall at Monticello, he had a copy of Leonardo's St. John the Baptist. And that painting, as far as I know, no longer exists or hasn't been identified. But what we have instead is Jefferson's description of the paintings that are in the main hall at Monticello. And that's a page of this famous document, which, by the way, is kept at special collection at UVA. And I just transcribed the description of the painting that is as John the Baptist, a bust of natural size, the right hand pointing to heaven, the left deeply shaded, it's scarcely seen pressing his breast, which is covered by his hair, flowing thickly over it. It is seen almost in full face on canvas, copied from Leonardo da Vinci. So those are, that's the way Jefferson describes the painting that he owned at Monticello, which must have been a copy of the original painting by Leonardo, which is now kept at the Louvre. So I hope that I sort of gave you a sense of why these shadow drawings I looked at in my book are so important, and how for Leonardo painting was about depicting shadows that seem to have no end. Those are his words. I love those words. So this is sfumato technique, for which it's famous. And sfumato technique is a modern word. He never used it. Sfumato technique originated in these natural shadows. And those were his means of situating figures in relation to one another, to us, the viewer, and to the cosmos, to the whole world. No fixed boundaries divided people from one another, or from objects, or from nature. Painting, therefore, was a technique for revealing the human soul that existed in such a universe, and doing so by way of light and shadow. That's what art and the science that was behind it could accomplish. And for Leonardo, that was enough. Or at least that's what I argue in my book.
Thank you so much, Francesca. What an informative presentation. At this point, I'm going to open it up to audience questions. I know we have one pre-submitted question, but how this is going to go, everyone here, feel free to either put a question in the chat. I will moderate that. You're also welcome to unmute and ask a question or raise your hand. I will start off with our pre-submitted question so people can start thinking about their own. So one of our audience members said, do you have any insight into how modern relevance shapes the curation of pieces from artists like Leonardo da Vinci, and if that changes over time in museums and galleries, depending on the way in which we deem the art currently important?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Leonardo would have loved how advanced technology is used today to study his paintings. I think, and I have to say that his works push restoration technologies to the limits. Lots of experimentation happens on his works. One can't do it for every work in museums around the world, but these new techniques are experimented on his works. I mentioned infrared. Infrared tells us many, many different things, but now infrared can be done at different levels inside the painting, and those different levels tell us all different things. And so we learn a great deal about his way of painting, but also about how Renaissance works more in general, change over time. And now that allows us also to restorers to be much more precise in the way they restore those works. Back in the past, the idea was that whenever there was something that needed to be done to a painting, you just repaint it and complete it with modern paint. That is no longer a shared view. A restoration for restorations, and actually most of the restorations are about taking away what had been added by others later on. And so I did not talk extensively about that, but all the restorations that I presented very briefly, and you have to imagine that before restorers put their hands on any of Leonardo's works, there are months, if not years, of research based on diagnostic, and it's all a non-invasive diagnostic. That is, they don't take any piece of that work, but there are diagnostics that allow us to understand better the state of the materials, what kind of materials have been used, and therefore understand better how they aged, and therefore how to intervene on them so as to delay as much as possible their decay. I don't know, that's a very complex answer, but I hope I helped a little to clarify it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We also have one in the chat. Do we know whether Leonardo used scientific instruments to aid his painting?
He certainly used he certainly used all sorts of, I mean, he had great eyes, but like every artist in this period, he must have used, you know, perspectival tools to facilitate the perspectival views. He certainly, I think he used mirrors as well. Dividers, rulers, I mean, all the elements, all the tools that were typical for drawing. And there was, I mean, that's just the way it was. There was no shame in that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting about the mirrors too. Obviously all aiding the perspective. Richard says, did you see the Salvator Mundi that was on the market a few years ago? Do you think it's at all likely that it is a Leonardo?
So I saw it when it was in an exhibition in London. It was 2012, so it was a number of years ago. After that, it has been very, very difficult to see it. And I saw it once it had been restored already. So all the restorations I described are restorations that, you know, are done with extensive diagnostic. They are done, they're followed by curators and restorers. Usually there is a committee of experts that follows the restoration. So, you know, sometimes restorers don't really know what to do. There are different hypotheses. So those hypotheses are run by this committee of experts, and there are debates, and that's just the way it is. So the best approach emerges from this conversation, dialogue, and exchange. That was not the process that was followed for the Salvator Mundi, for the restoration of the Salvator Mundi. And so having seen it only after the restoration had been done, and having seen that one, I saw it only through a protective glass. I did not see it in other way. I really cannot say. I really cannot say. I don't have enough elements to say it one way or another.
Deborah asks, what is your next book cover? If you can share.
Oh, wow. I should have, I mean, it's I'm working now. I mean, it's always this relationship between art and science that always interests me. And in the past, I worked a lot on cartography, on maps. I'm returning to that, but with a great interest to the global networks of the Renaissance. And so it's an amazing map. I might be able to show it to you. An amazing map made in Portugal, in Lisbon, 1502, tracing those trading routes around the world, but mentioning all the goods and the people, and also the slaves that were traded around the world. And that object, that from that object, I want to sort of tell the story of global trade in the early modern period. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, but it's a very beginning of the project. I mean, if I find the image, I'll show it to you because it's simply gorgeous. So, but what it is, it's returning to that. It's still always the art and science kind of approach. Okay, here I can share it. If you want to see it very quickly, you can go ahead with another question while I share the screen so that you can see this image. Here it is.
Wow, sneak peek. That was very beautiful.
Yes. So, but this is a project at the very, very beginning. So.
Well, we'll have to have you back next time to talk about your next book. And I actually have a question myself. And then I know it's about, it's already past 7, so I know I want to be respectful of people's time. But if anyone has any last questions, put in the chat or ask after I do, then feel free. I was wondering about your Leonardo class at UVA and how you say it's a very interdisciplinary crowd. You have some, history students, some art students, some, science majors. I was wondering if you have insights on how, the various different majors and people who are into arts versus sciences, how they approach art history. Do they have their, special analytical lenses, or can you see any differences or similarities?
It's very interesting because, at the beginning, there are the art history majors or those who have taken art history classes who get bored, right? Because they hear things that they know. And then there are, I call them the science students who have to sort of dive in, right? In this, and for them, it's a steep learning curve. And I tell them, you're not aligned, but in a few weeks they all align, and then they go. And they notice different things, and this is the beauty of it. And sometimes the virgin eyes, right, of somebody who is not trained in the field sees things that you do not see because it's like you. Habit has made you blind, right? And so it's always so incredibly interesting. I mean, there are questions that helped me a great deal throughout the years I taught this class, and certainly when I was finishing up the book. Yes. Yeah.
That is so interesting. And it looks like we have 2 last questions in the chat. So the first one is from Sean. He says he understands that Leonardo was a military engineer. How did this occupation inform his innovative arts and designs?
Yeah, so he was a military engineer, but he was more, I would say, a designer of military machines, rather than a builder. So his imagination went wild also in that field. He imagined all sorts of machines. And the point was not so much to build them for real. For instance, burning mirrors, that note that I showed you that he wrote as an old man, right, recalling the event of his youth. Well, that note, he wrote it when he was building burning mirrors as military weapons for the Pope in Rome. But he was doing that because he had read, like as many others in the Renaissance, that Archimedes of Syracuse had destroyed the Roman fleet with giant burning mirrors. So it was like, more of a competition with the ancient scientists that drove him. And many of his machines were actually never built, but they're amazing drawings, amazing drawings. So it is an artist there as well, visualizing, making visible ideas about machines, including what they call a tank, right? I mean, a tank that, I don't know, do you pedal inside a tank? Since, of course, there are no motors, right? So, yeah, it's very imaginative in this area as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. And it looks like we do have some things coming into the chat, but they are all well wishes. And thank you for what has been a very informative talk, very eye-opening. And thank you all for the great questions. Again, really appreciate it. And just want to extend a good evening from the Virginia Club of New York. And I hope you all have a great night, great beginning to the weekend tomorrow, and hope to see you all again at a future event, whether virtual or in person. And again, Professor Fiorani, really appreciate it. And also welcome to Michael Getz, who is our UVA Regional Engagement Officer. So he is in Charlottesville right now as well. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.